Hello everybody, my name is Dr. Andre. I'm Senior Researcher here at the Wilfred Martin Centre for European Studies, and I'm very happy to welcome you to this online discussion today. The topic is the US midterm elections and their implications for Europe, all change and no change. I'm delighted to welcome our two expert speakers from both sides of the Atlantic. We have Mark Strand, a good friend of the Martin Centre here in Brussels, who is president of the Congressional Institute. And we are also very happy to be joined by Professor Roberta Haar. She is Professor of Foreign Policy Analysis and Transatlantic Relations at the University of Maastricht here in Europe. Mark and Roberta, very welcome to the discussion. Just before we get started, just to let everybody know that this event is being live streamed live on our website and also on YouTube. In the coming days, it'll also be placed on our YouTube channel for playback. We have so much to discuss. We have less than an hour to discuss it. It was a fascinating campaign in many ways in the US, I think particularly from a European perspective. Very high inflation, low unemployment. We had the Dobbs decision on Roe v. Wade. And it really was a campaign where the momentum actually shifted several times over the course of the last several months. The format of this discussion is very simple. Mark, I'm going to start with you, if that's okay, and maybe you can just give us 7 to 8 minutes on, what the state of play is at the moment. How do you think it's going to, pan out in the next couple of days or whatever? And then after that, Roberta, I'll come to you and maybe we can talk more about what this means for Europe. So with that, Mark, I'm going to give you the floor.
Well, thanks, Owen. I appreciate it. It was far more of a red splash than a red wave. It was certainly the expectations Republicans had were disappointed by the outcome. And I think a couple of reasons for that. Part of what we don't quite yet know all the finals. It's kind of embarrassing. I noticed Brazil held the presidential election. They knew within 2 hours at the end of the vote who won. And we're now looking at states like Nevada, which we're hoping will finalize the results by Saturday. So it is embarrassing, but always remember the United States is not a federal system, does not hold it on the federal level, the elections. They're all held state by state, and each state has their own rules. But it is embarrassing, so I apologize on our behalf. Right now, it looks like the Republicans will win a slight majority in the House. 218 is majority. They are expecting to get anywhere between 224 and 228 by the time the counting is done. This is important because, in fact, the fact that Republicans control one house of government means they basically have a check on anything overly ideological by the administration. The Senate is truly unknown. We just don't know yet. Right now, there are 3 seats remaining. Republicans have won 49, Democrats 48, but 3 seats are pending. Remember, the Republicans, to have the majority, have to win 2 of those 3 seats, because Democrats only have to 50 because the vice president breaks a tie. Right now, the Democrat, Mark Kelly, leads in Arizona by about 5 points. I think that probably holds up. And the Republican leads in Nevada by 2 points, to 50 to 47.2. So it's a very close race, but there are a whole bunch of absentee and mail-in ballots yet to count, including many from Clark County, which is where Las Vegas is located, and tends to be more Democratic. So that one will go right down to the wire to see who wins. But assuming they split and you have 50 Republicans and 49 Democrats, then everything matters on Georgia, where the 2 candidates ran. Warnock got a slight edge, but by half a percentage point, but neither candidate got over 50%, meaning Georgia has to have a runoff, which will take place on December 6th. And it's likely, if things hold up as they are now, that will be for control of the Senate. Whoever wins Georgia will win the Senate, which 2 years ago was the exact same situation, where we had the 2 special elections in Georgia that allowed the Democrats to go from 48 to 50 and win the election and control the Senate. That will be a very dramatic month. Politicians will now not get Thanksgiving off. They'll be working all the way through, and I expect to see a huge amount of money, especially if it's for all the marbles. which is getting kind of, even as a Republican, I'm very uncomfortable with the amount of money being spent in these elections. It's kind of disturbing, but I don't think it's going to change anytime soon. So, yes, the Republicans have won control of the House, and the Senate will be very closely divided. It makes a big deal who wins the Senate, not so much for policy, because obviously the Senate has the filibuster, and the House has its say, but because the Senate exclusively controls all nominations, and that will include ambassadorships and court appointments and that sort of thing. And really, when McConnell was in the same situation where Pelosi had the House and Republicans had the Senate, all he did was work on confirming judges. So it is very important what the outcome. So the question is, what happened? The Republicans were doing so well in these polls, and they were thinking they were going to have a huge victory that night. Some of the predictions were getting kind of almost outrageous, were almost fantasy. Some of them were. But nonetheless, the Republicans had an edge on the issue of inflation and crime. And crime, both those issues still had an impact, particularly in places like New York. But something changed over the weekend, and I really think the main difference that changed was the fact that Donald Trump came out very visibly, floating the idea that he was going to run for president again. The Republicans had made huge gains. In August, they had been taking a hit because of the Dobbs decision, and because of Trump being in the news all the time about this investigation of his secret documents going on. What happened to a certain degree, Republicans, as when Trump was in the news and Dobbs was fresh, the numbers were going down. But then they sort of recovered. Trump faded from the news, and inflation became a key issue again. The Dobbs decision started fading a little bit. But I think when Donald Trump came out very visibly, he threw off the Republican plan. The Republican plan was to make this a referendum on Joe Biden. And to a certain extent, when Trump reemerged, it became a choice between Trump and Biden. And that's not something that was going to help the Republicans in this election. If you look at the demographics, one of the most striking differences was on married versus unmarried people. And it has to do with the generational thing, too. Republicans won married women by 14%. They lost unmarried women by 37%, which are younger women strongly affected by the Dobbs decision. Also, they don't like Donald Trump. So the reemergence of that kind of broke up the momentum the Republicans have been gaining amongst women, particularly suburban women, and made all these races much tighter. I think there was also a lot of a big issue of concern was threats against democracy. Now, the interesting thing is 79% of voters said they were concerned about democracy in the United States, but they were evenly split between the two parties. So this is a concern that both parties have for different reasons. But nonetheless, you should be assured that just like many people in Europe worry about our democracy, so do a lot of Americans. And this is something both parties have. So I think we'll see over the days how this all plays out in terms of the final numbers and counts. But I think the big story here that the Republicans kind of overplayed their hand in terms of their expectations, but nonetheless, they did still win the election, but very narrow. The one other thing I will add in, this is going to lead to a whole bunch of party leadership struggles. Who's going to lead? Kevin McCarthy is the Republican majority leader now. He would like to be speaker. He will encounter some resistance from members of the Freedom Caucus, which is the more far-right element within the caucus. They did not get the numbers they thought they were going to get. Many of the candidates that Donald Trump endorsed in the primaries lost the election, so they didn't get the huge numbers they got. But nonetheless, you don't need a lot because the speaker has to be elected by the entire House, not just nominated by the party. I mean, McCarthy will have no trouble getting nominated by the party. The question is, will there be enough Freedom Caucus people to withhold their votes on the floor and prevent McCarthy from getting 218 votes and throw the election open again? And so we'll see what that plays out. The Republicans are planning their leadership elections next week, but we don't know who the Republicans are going to be yet. And so it may take some time before that happens. The other thing is, what does Mrs. Pelosi do? One of the fondest rumors here is that she would like to become an ambassador to Italy. and when she leaves the Congress. But the other thing is, will she leave? She really built this majority, and that she's, I think, responsible for a lot of the Democrats' success. But she has hinted that she would step down. Hakeem Jeffries from New York is waiting to take the place. But other thing is that Steny Hoyer, the second in charge, and Mr. Clyburn, the third in charge, have also said they're not planning on leaving. And so will that create a generational fight within the Democratic Party? So a lot of action yet to happen before we know before January 3rd, when the new Congress takes place.
That's really it's really fascinating to get your perspective. I think a red splash is a good description of what happened, and certainly I think I can't help but agree with you about the Trump effect over the weekend, because even I was in Washington about 10 days ago, and the Republicans were very bullish. And I was talking to the same Republicans maybe 2 to 3 days ago, and it was just before the election, after Trump had teased his big announcement of November 15th or whatever. And yeah, it was certainly a different view. But Roberta, if I can come to you now, I guess from this side of the Atlantic, before the election, there was a lot of lingering concerns about what would these elections mean for EU-US cooperation, Ukraine, climate change, etc. So I was just wondering, I'd be interested in getting your take on where do you think the transatlantic relationship stands now?
Yes, thank you very much. I do want to, we definitely, many concerns were already mentioned, and I would add to that some of the transatlantic concerns or the geopolitical pressures that were happening leading up to these midterms. And I do think they were immense, especially those related to Putin's attempts to starve Europe, principally Germany, of natural gas needed to fuel industry in Germany and the electrical grid there. And I think Putin's aim to splinter support for Ukraine as this economic pain intensifies, especially you see factories maybe closing down, or homeowners can't affording to pay their heating bills. All these things are pressure that Europeans are feeling as they look across the Atlantic. So we really are looking at sort of the worst crisis in 50 years for energy crisis. And then we see Biden's failures leading up to in his July visit to the Persian Gulf, and then later trying to rectify the pressures that Putin was going to put on. So those pressures that his failures, I think, also adds to geopolitical pressures. We didn't mention this yet, but I want to maybe speak also a little bit about international meddling, especially again by Russia and China. So this trying to insert themselves into the midterms. And there was a report, maybe your readers are also, or your watchers are also aware of this report released by Meta in September that detailed how Chinese and Russian networks were mounting a social media influence operation to sway the voters in America. And actually both parties, they were attacking both parties. They had as many as 60 websites that were trying to have a very extreme, divisive partisan messaging on things like abortion, certainly Roe versus Wade, that's already been mentioned, the pandemic, racial injustice, police brutality, things like promoting the prospects of a civil war, suggesting that violence is a way to rectify democracy's failings. And these things are really targeted in swing states. So we could see that there's also outside meddling by they're putting pressure on this geopolitical pressure. So I want to switch maybe to how Biden then responded to some of these pressures leading up to the Biden administration, how they respond to these pressures. And I think that it was clear that he prioritized support for Ukraine. And early on, I wrote an article for Atlantic Perspective here in the Netherlands that really talked about Biden administration's response being historic. I think that his decision to lead the international coalition would have been something that was that was called for. That could not have been. It was new. I'm coming to bouncing my words all of a sudden, but I think his leadership. the leadership mantle that he took over isolationist sentiment also within his own party. Maybe you heard in October there was a letter that came out from the Progressive Caucus, sort of appeared and then disappeared. But there were 30 members of Biden's own party who are against sort of the strong support that we have against in Ukraine. So I do think that the fact that he did this, and also many Republicans supporting this, I think was historic. So the U.S. really took a new return to a role as being a key driver of West's unified response to Putin's aggression. And I think his desire to hold NATO countries together or to encourage them to spend more was successful. Even Germany delivered new high-tech air defense missile systems. So I think that shows that Biden was successful. The Netherlands also promised in October to send 14.5 million worth of air defense missiles. So I think those are all very historic things that maybe Trump wanted to do but wasn't successful in doing. I would also like to point out that this is bipartisan support for things that are happening in Ukraine. But I also think that Putin and Xi Jinping managed with their no limits partnership to really bring in a bipartisan policy over Ukraine. I think that many things within the U.S. electorate, that many things are subject to polarization. But I think in this case, this is not that both parties realize that should not be polarized. And even Mitch McConnell talked about that the Biden administration should move faster on delivering weapons to Ukraine. I also think that there's bipartisan support, very clear in a U.S. stance on China. So, and this also includes how to deal with China's it's the whole technology competition. So helping Ukraine is one part, but also there's this bipartisan support in how to deal with and even also thinking about supporting Taiwan in a Chinese military sort of belligerency there. And certainly the new national security strategy that came out in October really then bolsters this idea that China is the greatest geopolitical challenge facing the U.S. But I have a lot of feedback. Does everything sound okay?
Yeah,
From sound call still okay?
From our end is fine.
Okay. Also, I think that China is really viewed as the only power capable on the world stage to remake the international order, which I think is very much more consequential than what Putin and his imperialist power will do in the longer term. So, and what I want to mention that certainly this is part of the midterms, this whole Ukraine fatigue that really came up in the midterms, especially by some of the candidates like J.D. Vance, or even we mentioned now Kevin McCarthy also talking about, well, if Republicans are in power, we'll rethink the Ukraine stance. And I do think that some of the isolationists that ran, they could have an effect. We've already mentioned the Freedom Caucus. Definitely the Freedom Caucus has also been a bit worried about, or been giving some feelers about Ukraine will change policy. And I do think that if we would have a return to Trump's transactional foreign policy, this was definitely go back to fraying transactional ties. And I know that Bolton also said that if Trump would come back into office, that's very likely that the U.S. would leave NATO. So I think that would undermine collective security, certainly contribute to eroding ties across the Atlantic. I think it would also contribute to Putin's calculations that the U.S. would not support Europe in Ukraine. Certainly what happened, these political divisions within America gave Putin the idea that he could play pipeline politics, that his calculations that he could ride out Western sanctions, wait for Ukraine fatigue to set in, and with cold houses and high gas prices, that he could wait for that. And there certainly have been some candidates also speaking on Fox News that there's this growing effort of isolationists on the right who could then somehow unite with isolationists on the left. But I would like to point out that anti-Ukraine fatigue, I think, also is evident also here in Europe. This is a point that was made to me very much clear when I gave a lecture in The Hague recently, and in September, and someone in the audience asked me why America wants to support Ukraine. When I first heard that, I was kind of like taken aback. I didn't know how to respond to that immediately. But but I think it's very clear that Ukraine fatigue is also an element here. But I think when America's role in defending Ukraine and its right to exist is up to debate here, and a very strong Atlanticist ally, I think then contemplating how U.S. foreign policy might change if you have more isolationist voices, if those isolationist voices can have much more of an influence in the House and maybe in less so in the Senate. I do think then we can say that these midterm elections will have more impact in the future, and certainly will narrow the path to U.S. continued assistance in Ukraine. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Roberta. Yeah, it's very interesting, and you make the very good point, which I always make, which is that Ukraine fatigue always starts closest to home, and certainly I think in Europe we're seeing very worrying signs as the winter approaches of some cracks in the support for Ukraine. I have good news and I have bad news. The good news is that we're getting lots of questions from our viewers. The bad news is that they tend all to correlate around a couple of key issues. So, Mark, I'll come to you first. We're getting a lot of questions about what does this mean for the role of former President Trump in terms of his influence on the Republican Party as we move to 2024, particularly in the context of some very good Republican results in Florida, and the dynamics that might emerge there between the rivals perhaps in the future.
Yeah, it's a great question, and you're right. In Florida, they did have a red wave in Florida. I mean, they picked up 4 seats in the House, and DeSantis won. This is a guy who won by less than 1% 4 years ago. Won by over 20% this time. Did very well in Miami-Dade County, which is a very strong Democrat county, but 75% Hispanic. And he switched from losing it by 20 points 4 years ago to winning it by 11 points this time. So huge swing. And he gave a speech for his election night that sounded very much like an interest in running for president. DeSantis is kind of like I think has a lot of momentum, but he's also getting a lot of warnings from the Trump people. But there's no doubt in my mind that Trump's momentum or his ability to sort of dominate the party took a big hit in this election. There's already talks that he's now going to cancel his presidential announcement, especially in the view of the fact that we won't even know who controls the Senate. Republicans are asking him overtly to stay out of Georgia, for the runoff, because he kind of actually did more damage than help in the last, 2 years ago in that race. So the question is the Republican Party monolithically behind Donald Trump? And the answer is no, even though a lot of people like to portray it that way. And this is interesting. I think Ukraine might actually become an issue between the two of them. DeSantis is very kind of like an old Reagan conservative on foreign policy. He's a former military guy himself. And so I think that might actually become part of the issue. But I do want to say, and I think Roberta's analysis is very good, is that even on this whole issue of isolationism, the Republican Party and Trumpism, there's still overwhelming support for Ukraine. In fact, the most recent Republican complaints I've heard is that the Biden administration did not approve our most advanced drones for use in Ukraine. And so the effort right now, even the Freedom Caucus itself, is filled with a lot of very foreign policy hawkish conservatives. So that I'm not as worried about. I do worry about, but I do think it'll be an interesting debate over our relations with Europe and other parts of the world if we get into a good competitive presidential race, which could include, besides Ron DeSantis, who I think is Trump's greatest threat, also Nikki Haley, the former ambassador, Senator Tim Scott, the Republican governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. Be some interesting candidates that might get in this race. But the other thought is that if it's a one-on-one race, DeSantis versus Trump, there's a better chance that DeSantis might win that race.
Yeah, that's very interesting. And Mark, I think you've actually answered one of the other questions, which was, the role of former President Trump in a winner takes all Georgia runoff in December. Yeah, and I think we're certainly seeing here in the media a lot of people hoping that from the Republican side that he stays.
I would just say one thing is that when he last time 2 years ago in Georgia, he was questioning the integrity of the polling place, and a whole bunch of Republicans say, well, it doesn't matter my vote because they won't count my vote. And he actually undermined the Republican vote significantly because of his complaints about the integrity of the election.
Yeah, exactly. And I think from what I saw this morning that the gap between Warnock and Herschel Walker in Georgia, we're talking only, yeah, exactly, maybe 20,000 votes or something. So every vote really does count. Roberta, if I could come back to you then, I was just thinking, possibly then that the transatlantic relationship maybe will not be too kind of affected by, the actual results of these midterms, and maybe, I suppose, what we would like to term in Brussels as kind of the gradual reapproachment between Washington and Brussels, particularly on kind of the nitty-gritty of trade with the Trade and Technology Council and stuff like that it might progress in a more kind of consistent and balanced way. I was just wondering what you think.
But I think, indeed, with Ukraine, I think that the midterms probably won't have a great deal of impact on Ukraine. And I think on China policy as well, that the midterms will not have an impact. In fact, I think that Biden has been incredibly Trumpy in his policies towards China. And if anything, not lifting any of the war that Trump had, the trade war that Trump had with China. He didn't really lift any of that. And if anything, has doubled down with the initiatives, with the CHIPS Act, with the recent ban on even European chip technology going to China. All those things, I think, are he has gone further than Trump in the war with China, or the upcoming relationship with China. So I don't think that things will change there. I do think, and I must say I'm less confident on talking about trade things, but I do think that if anything, trade relations across the Atlantic will become more fraught. Because I think that Scholz and Macron don't have very good relations, as I understand it, with each other, but they seem to agree on one point in particular, and that is that U.S. is being too protectionist in its trade, that we need to have some sort of response, even maybe taking the U.S. to WTO, of what with the whole Build Back Better, with the whole buy everything that the U.S. is going to do. This great big infrastructure bill that has been passed in the U.S. Everything should be bought in America. Somehow it should really not have anything to do with world partners in trade, or supply chain should really be based in the U.S. rather than global supply chains. So I think in this regard that there's going to be indeed some friction across the Atlantic between America and its allies, just because Biden's idea of making America more competitive with China is really to improve its industrial base, its manufacturing base, its technology base, its silicon making base, all those things. Of course, the Europeans believe that too. So if you're in this regard, they're going to be very much in competition, and they might also be in competition for biohealth technology as well, dealing with an outbreak of COVID or different something similar. I think there are other chances of transactions to be fraught than in with Ukraine and with China.
We've got another couple of questions come in. Mark, one is on about the messaging that was employed by both sides during the midterm election campaign, and about which side was really more effective in its campaigning messaging. Like, it could be that it could have been both sides, because from the exit polls that I've seen, it was inflation, it was crime, it was, reproductive rights. I was just wondering what's the sense of it in the States?
It's a very interesting thing. The Democrat, normally in an election, you appeal to your base first, and then you start to reach out towards the middle. To a certain degree, the Republicans were doing that with their inflation message and crime message, and that worked. But the Democrats actually turned a very base-oriented message to their own base to encourage them to come out. And I think that helped them too, because it actually drove up their vote at the end. And they ended up, especially among younger voters, they turned out, which are notoriously very bad at voting in midterm elections. And so, to a certain degree, I think their messaging both accomplished what they were aiming for, but because of our highly polarized politics, and you cannot overstate how polarized American politics is today, is that in the end, both kind of held serve. It was a very even election. I mean, if you look at the vote, the Republicans won the overall national vote on Congress, but that, of course, is a meaningless vote because we don't elect people by national, like a national list. They're elected in individual districts. And so you could say they're both effective, or they effectively canceled each other out. And we'll see. We end up having a lot of people who felt very strongly about inflation voted Republican, but a lot of people who were concerned about inflation still stayed home and voted Democrat. So, yeah, I think you have to say that both parties were effective, or at least canceled each other out in this polarized environment.
We just had another question in on, it's the question I always get asked in Brussels over the last couple of years, which is, former President Trump was very open in his criticisms of NATO and, the European Transatlantic Security Compact. If we do have, a situation where both the House and the Congress are controlled by Republicans, even if by a very, wafer thin majority, do you think that sort of rhetoric might come back again from the United States side, particularly as we might be entering into a period where economic growth is significantly lower than it has been since the end of the pandemic?
I guess that would depend on what type of Republicans have the loudest voices in both houses of Congress. Because I think there are many, many Republicans who share, who have a strong belief in the alliance system. I mean, I talked a little bit about the national security strategy, but Trump's national security strategy, which was written by H.R. McMaster and his senior staff on the National Security Council, was very much in support of alliances as well. And I don't think Trump actually knew what was in his own national security strategy. At least he didn't appear to know what was in it when he presented it in December 2017. But I think there are many people, and when Trump was first elected office, of course, he had lots of generals who are in his cabinet. And those generals, like McMaster, like Mattis, even Tillerson, they were all very pro alliance system, not only the NATO alliance, also the alliances with South Korea and Japan. So I think there are many within the Republican Party who align with Biden's ideas about, so they will have commonality in foreign policy. In fact, there might be more commonality in foreign policy than any other policy area within America. So I think, not in the trade that I just talked about, but certainly dealing with allies and with belligerents, including China and Russia. I think the national security strategy that Trump had treated China and Russia as the same, whereas Biden's national security strategy really looks at China as a greater threat. And in fact, it was supposed to come out in February, and it didn't come out in February because, something happened in February. Putin invaded Ukraine, and so the Biden administration didn't release the national security strategy and then rewrote it, and it only came out in October, which of course, 2 years into administration, telling everybody what your security strategy, it seems kind of late. But given that the circumstances, they had to go back to the drawing board and put Russia in. Obviously, must have been very high, but still, they think that. I think in the Biden administration, they also think that Russia and China have their relationship maybe is not as strong as they appear to show to the outside world, and they think there's maybe possibility to drive a wedge between them, which also would be. I think Russia seems much more and more isolated. And even when Putin met recently with Xi Jinping in India, they're both very critical of the war. So I think Russia's becoming more and more isolated, and that's a good thing, I guess, for Europeans and for Americans. And I think both Republicans and Democrats will agree upon that.
Yeah, absolutely. Mark, we've got loads of questions. I think we have plenty of questions to fill this hour and maybe a couple of more hours. But I do have a very interesting question, which is about the governor's races, which we haven't really discussed yet. But the impression here was, at least, just from reading the headlines in the European media, is that the Democrats played pretty good kind of defense, in Michigan, in Pennsylvania, even their governor in Kansas, I think, held on again for another term. So that kind of, I don't know if you just want to make a general comment about some of the governor's races, but also there's a follow-on kind of question from myself that I'd like to put to both of you, which is, are we witnessing the kind of the geographical landscape continue to evolve in the States, in that, can we really now describe Florida as a toss-up state? Has that gone firmly kind of purple/red, while the new battlegrounds are actually, in places like Nevada, Georgia, maybe North Carolina, in the Democrats' wildest dreams, places like that? I don't know. I'd just be interested for your assessment.
Great questions. The governor's race is pretty much, it was a good thing to be an incumbent. The only two places where both Arizona and Nevada are still up in the air. I think in Arizona, probably Kerry Lake, the Republican, squeaks out of victory, while I think Kelly holds on to the Senate seat. But that would be an interesting race. But even, places like New York were close. That 53-47 for a Republican in New York is very good. And while the Republican, Lee Zeldin, did not win, his strong campaign helped actually. Republicans picked up more seats in New York than they did in Florida. I mean, it's pretty interesting dynamics that happen. And that's an issue where the crime issue was just a very dramatic thing. But to the other extent, to a large degree, people are asking Republicans, stop moving to Florida because we have enough Republicans here now. There's so many New Yorkers that have moved to Florida that maybe that cost Zeldin the election. But yeah, I think Florida has now become a red state. Marco Rubio is running for re-election, and he also won a large double-digit victory. And remember, Rubio is also a very pro-Ukraine, anti-Russian senator in terms of his views. So I think that from that point of view, yes, Florida has changed, but you're also right. The battleground's shifting. I think the West is becoming much more interesting. Arizona and Texas, which was Democrats thought would demographically come their way, is really not. And part of that dynamic has to do with the Hispanic vote, which has been shifting. It wasn't as dramatic a shift as the Republicans were hoping, but nonetheless, they've got about 40% of the Hispanic vote, which is the best they've done since George W. Bush's second term, when he got 44%. So it's been a while since they've been doing that well, and so that's changed. I did want to add one point to what Roberta's saying, is that in some ways there may be on trade as long as they don't try to do a comprehensive agreement, which I think is impossible, on issues such as allied supply chains, especially on things like medicine and computers, and also on issues in terms of energy production. They will actually find a very receptive audience with Republicans. And Europe is going to need a lot of energy. The Americans would like to sell Europe a lot of energy. And that's a very strong thing with the Republicans. So I think that's something to keep in mind too. But I don't want to get too far off subject. But
and actually, it ties in. Roberta, I'm not sure if you want to make any comment on kind of the shifting geographical battlegrounds.
I think that Mark is much more able to answer that. But maybe I would like to come add to that that it's interesting how not only geographic, so maybe the type of voter or the type of member of these parties. I think the Republican Party had a very different composite of the members of the Republican Party than they are now, and a lot of that has to do with more working class or Trump appealing to a different feeling and hearing their pain. And I think a lot of people in let's say the states where I come from South Dakota, I think a lot of them feel like the coastal elites are treating them a little bit disdainfully or a little bit they're not concerned with the economic and or maybe the dignity levels of things that they're feeling that they're being ignored or so I think that the people who are members of the Republican Party are much different than they were before Trump, and it might be that that Liz Cheney or people like Adam Kinzinger, the other people that are more critical of Trump, they might then break away and form a new type of party that the Republican Party could split into two different factions. I'd be curious to hear what Mark would say of something about the possibility of a shift of a split of the Republican Party.
It's interesting that Donald Trump likes to apply the label rhino to Republicans, like Republican in name only. But if there's a Republican in name only, it's Donald Trump, because he actively celebrated the loss of certain Republican candidates in this last election. On the other hand, it's also hard to believe that Liz Cheney was the chair of the Republican conference. I mean, she was the top leader of the party at the beginning of this term in Congress, and now you see she was endorsing Democrat candidates. Still, nonetheless, the Republicans are kind of united in their opposition to the Democrats, and so I don't really see a splinter party. I could see the way they could cannibalize each other before the next election and ensure Joe Biden's reelection if there's a most difficult primary. But one of the things that is attractive about DeSantis versus Trump is that most people who support Donald Trump could support DeSantis on the policy issues, but not, but there's just a huge difference in their personalities and their styles of governing. And so, to a large degree, even if that happens, I don't think if DeSantis wins the nomination, I don't think the Trump people leave in mass. There might be some, but that always happens. But I think that there's a danger if Donald Trump wins the nomination that the enthusiasm level is so low that Biden wins anyway. So,
Roberta, just a question came in about that COP27 is going on at the minute, the big climate change conference, and I guess the assumption would be that Biden's the funding and investment he provided for climate change under the Inflation Reduction Act and other pieces of legislation that will kind of continue this this lukewarm reapproachment between Brussels and help with the rapprochement between Brussels and Washington over the next 2 years. I think, notwithstanding that there are issues within that about Buy America, and that the French and the Germans have a particular affection for their automotive industries. So, but in general, I think in climate change, I feel that the next 2 years will be maybe one of balanced kind of general progress. Maybe, I don't know. I hope.
Yeah, well, certainly, the lead up to the midterms meant that everybody forgot about climate and only thought about what would help win elections. And it definitely points to the importance of fossil fuels within America, what the price of the gas pump is and who do you blame for that. So I think, and that's certainly the strategic reserve that was released as all designed very much to have voters not thinking about the price of fuel and how it contributes to inflation in America, so being the worries about inflation. But now that the midterms are over, maybe we do have some time, and I do think it's wonderful that the Inflation Reduction Act does contain so many things that addressing climate. But it's something, and I think maybe it was Mark that we talked about the other day, that if 9% of Republicans think that climate change is a priority, that is a problem. We need to have all of America thinking that doing something about climate is important. and that the initiatives that are in the Inflation Reduction Acts are important, and that we should definitely, because climate, of course, is a global issue, we should work together with our allies in particular, and even with our not so nice, our frenemies and those who we're more belligerent with. We need to work with them as well. We need to work with China in particular and try to do something, go forward on climate.
Mark, a question. This has been, I suppose, it gets probably a lot more airtime in Europe than it does in the United States, maybe over the last couple of years. But there's an element of European thought which has become slightly obsessed recently with kind of these old school, I suppose what would be described in the Trump age or the post-Trump age as these kind of old school kind of moderate Republicans that can get elected in, overwhelmingly democratic states. I'm thinking about, Larry Hogan maybe in Maryland, or Chris Sununu in New Hampshire. And I'm just thinking, do you think now that because of the way the votes have gone, that there will be kind of a bigger place in the debate within the Republican parties for more moderate voices who have been in a lot of ways kind of sidelined over the last maybe 6 or 8 years?
Yeah, it's a great question, and it's, I think, one worth examining for some time to come. I mean, the ironic thing is that the people who are now considered moderates of the old Reagan wing of the party, and I don't think Ronald Reagan was ever called a moderate in his entire life. So, a lot of it depends on the times and the issues, and sometimes those are what shape the person. I do think that Republicans, Chris Sununu, I think, is an interesting Republican who could do things. We'll see. A lot of them are shaped by the states. I mean, Maryland, for instance, is a very blue state. It's a very Democrat state. And the fact that Larry Hogan could get elected means that there are a whole bunch of Democrats that liked him. There's not the same breakdowns. When Reagan was president, the Democrat Party was still very strong in the southern part of the United States, but there was a very conservative element of that party that ended up supporting Reagan. That's kind of sorted out, and so the party switches have occurred. So I think there's a place for a strong leader. I think Americans in general. So one of the lessons you could take from this midterm was that there still is a growing desire for normal candidates. A lot of the more extreme candidates on both sides were rejected. What the new normal is going to be, I think we'll be seeing over time. But certainly, as Roberta pointed out, the PayPal's letter on Ukraine was rejected by a lot of Democrats, just as it was rejected by a lot of Republicans. And so there still is a center in this country. We just haven't had a candidate in a while who's been able to appeal to it. And the question is, what politicians smart enough to figure out how to do that? I have a feeling they will have a very strong success in the future. For instance, climate change is an issue that you're right. Roberta and I were talking the other day, 9% of Republicans think it's the biggest issue, which is very small. But if you also ask them, what's your view on climate? Most of them will tell you they are concerned, but they don't think it's practical yet. That we're not ready to turn away from the fossil fuels. We should be making progress towards one, but let's do what they would call all of the above. We'll continue to pursue clean energy at the same time we continue to produce natural gas and liquefied natural gas and other things. And so it'll be an interesting debate. But I do think there's a very important element to the question is that what kind of leader is going to emerge in the future of this currently very polarized country who can figure out a way to appeal to both parties? And again, that's sort of a big generational test. We're going to see. You get great presidents once every generation, and it's been more than one since we've had one. So we'll see.
It's true.
Maybe it's interesting to add that a third of Americans are registered. About a third are registered as Democrats. About a third are registered as Republicans, and about a third are registered as independents. So it's really these independents that have to be captured. And there's maybe a number that Democrats don't like to hear very often, but 9.2 million voters in America voted for Obama, but then switched and voted for Trump. So there's at least 10 million Americans out there that can be persuaded by a candidate who has not only charisma like Obama had, but also maybe a good message, or that feels the pain that Trump obviously told his voters, that I feel your pain and I'll go to Washington and shake things up because these coastal elites don't seem to be listening to you. So I think that there is room for something new to emerge in America, but then it has to then listen to this middle part, this third of America that needs to be brought aboard.
Yeah, and I'm just thinking that we only have about 5 or 10 minutes left. Is that if we take these results or nearly results that we have, as Mark said at the beginning, this kind of red splash, which I guess is it's significant in the fact that the historical precedence tends to be kind of a major shift away from the party of the president during the midterms. Not in every cycle, but for the majority of cycles. So it's significant, I think, just in that context alone. But as the great thing about the United States system is that you're never more than 2 years away from a major election cycle. So I'm just thinking, like, on both the Republican side and on both the Democratic side, what will be kind of the key lessons they take, or how will they perhaps, seek to shift, some of their messaging? Maybe I'm thinking about the Republicans on reproductive rights, because one thing we didn't discuss today was the ballot measures in about 5 or 6 states tended to favor, pro-choice, free choice. So I thought that was interesting. So I'm just wondering how it will affect, like, both on the economic side, on the international relations side, on the social side. I was just wondering if you had kind of any thoughts or feelings on how you think this could potentially kind of play out over the next 12 or 18 months.
Fascinating question, and I think we will see that. I think even on issues like abortion, one of the mistakes people made was thinking that there was a sudden sea change and shift in the American people. This has been an emotional issue for 50 years. And what the Supreme Court did is create a system, not unlike Europe, where each individual country decides their policy. Well, each individual state decides it. And I think what you're going to see is that once all the rhetoric gets done, they'll start working the nuances, and there'll be compromises. Some states will allow abortion longer than others. Others will have a shorter period of time, but it'll be the voters who basically end up deciding that, which in the end might be a much healthier way to resolve a debate like this. But we'll see. It is an emotional issue. It tends to have an emotional pull. I think, though, one of the things we learned from this election too was, though, that voters don't like extremism on either side. Mitch McConnell made a comment about the quality of your candidates does in fact matter. And I think what we saw that was quality candidates who can appeal to a broad swath of the population of their state do better than candidates who are trying to appeal to a very specific and narrow element of their state. And so, one of the things we've always said about polarization is that the negativity will end when the voters want it to end, right? Because in democracies, politicians are pretty good at picking up their cues because they'd like to keep their job. And when the voters start to say, we don't want this anymore, we want you to start doing things on our behalf and work together, for Pete's sakes, I think you will see some of this change come. Right now, the loudest voices, amplified by social media to a certain degree, are in the extremes. And this is an overall, we could have a whole hour discussion on the influence of social media in our politics. But in the end, they're not the only voices. And when people get dissatisfied enough with the current course of events, they'll make the changes, and the politicians will respond, because that's what politicians are. That's what they do. They respond to what their voters want them to do so they can keep their jobs.
Well, I heard something on some of the post-election analysis that in exit polls, they asked voters why they think America is so divided. What is the source of this division? And the number one reason they thought was social media. So I think Americans are aware that they're being played, let's say, that these platforms are there to make money and sell advertising and not necessarily to inform them well. So I think maybe through, over time, we can see that what this reaching out to the other side is much more evident. But I do think the elections are themselves an emotional act. So how do you feel in the day? Do you feel that your pocketbook is emptier, or do you feel that are you worried that Trump is going to run again, as we started this hour? I think that is very clear. Also, the roller coaster ride of what happened in October or happened over the summer, all those things point to elections being very emotional acts for Americans.
Squeeze in one last question, because it's come in about 5 or 6 different forms, but it's actually the same question at its core. Is that, and I think this is certainly reflective of how the results are being portrayed in Europe, is what would a potential President DeSantis, what would a DeSantis presidency mean, or what could it possibly mean for America's relationship with Europe and with NATO? Mark, I think you mentioned that he's kind of like a classical Reagan conservative, maybe, so in a sense it wouldn't be a major structural shift.
No, I don't think. I think he would be very supportive of the relationship. Florida does a lot of business with Europe, and so it's not an unimportant thing from the governor's point of view. This is one of the advantages of having a governor run instead of a senator, is that governors tend to look at it in a more executive level and in terms of trade issues. And right now, trade with Europe is a very good thing for Florida. So I think you'll see some positive things. It doesn't mean all the issues will instantly be resolved. But I also think that if Joe Biden does not run for re-election, which is a possibility, is that you might see another governor on the Democrat side emerge, maybe Gavin Newsom in California. And that would be a very interesting race, and probably a fairly healthy race in the United States to have two governors running in a very policy-oriented election. Because governors, by necessity, since they govern 100% of the people, tend to at least know how to moderate their language at the right times and to appeal to large groups of people. And one of the things DeSantis showed was that he could appeal to a lot of people who voted against him 4 years before. Especially in places like Miami-Dade County, where he just made huge inroads into Democratic communities. That, to me, is the kind of politician, the future, whether it's him or somebody else on either side, people who can get people in the other party to vote for them in this highly polarized environment are the ones who are going to have success going forward.
Roberta, I can give the final word to you.
Well, I must say, I don't know enough about DeSantis's policies to add to that, but I do hope that we can return to sort of a normal disagreement, a normal opposition, a normal party in power, rather than having a very Trumpian opposition. I mean, I think that if we could get back to less chaos, more real debates on real issues, because of course Trump doesn't care about policy. He only cares about what he wanted, how he could monetize the executive branch or monetize the whole of the U.S. conduct, and even how they stayed at his resorts in Ireland, his golf resorts. So I think if we could get beyond that, it would be much better, whoever that might be.
Yes, that's true. I will make no comment on the condition of the Trump golf resort in Ireland. We are very grateful for American investment. On that note, I want to thank Roberta. I want to thank Mark. I have to say, I really enjoyed the discussion. I learned a lot. I hope you did as well, and our viewers online. And with that, I will end the event and I will say goodbye. Thank you very much.